Steve, you're up.
I agree entirely with what you say, by the way. I do think that there is a special obligation on behalf of the non-Muslims to stand up and object to what is going on, because our silence is complicitous. And we cannot allow this situation to say, you know, they are separate, special, different. We are not touched by this. And we know that the famous saying from the Second World War, you know, first they came for the Jews. I didn't say anything because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And that is certainly true of all of us, and I hope to demonstrate that today. By the way, I just want to mention my wife is a quilter, and I'm with Project Salam. I'm also with the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, and in order to express solidarity, she decided to make a banner out of our logo and hang it up. And this is the first time I've ever hung this thing up. And I would like to be able to tell her that when it was unveiled, there was applause from the audience. Thank you. She'll be deeply appreciative of that. Now, the other thing I just wanted to mention here quickly is this is a wall of names. And I always like to bring this wherever I go to someplace. I want to bring this wall of names because I don't want this thing to become an academic debate about high, lofty legal principles. We're talking about real people, real suffering here about a large group of people. There is about 150 names on this wall, but in our database of Project Salam, the National Coalition, we have about 739. Kathy's in charge of.
Yeah, there's a few duplicates. We have like 780, but then there's
right.
Probably around 750.
750 names. So I would need 12 of these just to cover the cases, 12 panels, just to cover the number of cases that we are handling. And of course, we don't have time to talk about all of them, but each one of them is individual, and each one of them deserves respect and attention. I wanted to back up just a little bit at the beginning to try to frame this from a legal point of view, because I agree entirely with what the prior people said. This is a movement, it's a time in history, and we have to understand it in that context. But the law is bent to reflect that sense that we're getting from the general public about this fear of Islam. In a sense, war and law are opposites. In law itself is supposed to apply to everybody equally, right? This is why we have the law, so that everybody is treated equally. In war, we single out a particular group of people, and we target all our resources on them. And they are the enemy. So in a time of war, we try to mobilize all the resources of the community to bear on the enemy. And unfortunately, one of the resources that gets drawn into this is the law itself. The law that is supposed to treat everybody equally gets drawn in to start to treat one group of people differently. And I think the best example of that, by the way, is the Japanese internment. You remember this is during World War II. They passed a law that said that anyone of Japanese ancestry, imagine that, ancestry, you could be a U.S. citizen, but as long as you were Japanese ancestry, you had to be moved to a concentration camp away from the West Coast. And Fred Korematsu challenged that, went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, yes, that was proper. It was okay for the law to discriminate against Japanese at that time. And I think there's an interesting sequel to that in that Fred Korematsu, many years later, brought a challenge to his conviction on the grounds, and it was eventually overturned in the lower courts, on the grounds that at the time of the argument in the Supreme Court, the Solicitor General representing the United States lied to the Supreme Court and said that there was a study which showed that the Japanese were a security risk. In fact, there was a study, and it showed just the opposite. And it showed conclusively. And so I've often used this as an example that when the law is used as a weapon of war, truth is usually the first consequence, the first casualty. And I think that the Korematsu case is a great example of that. After World War II, we sort of slid seamlessly into the Cold War. And this was also a war of ideology. It's against ideology. In this case, where you have these very asymmetric wars, ideology itself becomes like guns and bullets and tanks. And so we had the witch hunts and things like that. And we've had ideological warfare before. We had the Palmer raids, communist witch hunts, all of these kind of things. So there has been a kind of a continual battle of ideology. But I think it's important to note that in these cases, in each case, they tried to draw this back to a foreign country of some sort. Then, again, we moved seamlessly after that. As the Cold War was winding down, we moved as a country into a series of battles over ideology, domestic ideology. There became liberation movements. There was the Puerto Rican liberation movement, and the Native American liberation movement, and the Black Panthers, and so on. And the government decided to treat this, again, as an extension, I think, of the Cold War, and they used a lot of the techniques that were used then. We had the smearing and the sneering and the disruption, the activists going in and the FBI going in and disrupting activist meetings. And they went even further, particularly with the Black Panthers. They actually engaged in framing people for murders. I included them on here because I just wanted to make sure that we never forget that a group of people, and I have here Fred Hampton, he was assassinated. Mark Clark was assassinated by an FBI concocted scheme, although it was by the Chicago police. Mumia Abu-Jamal, Jamal al-Amin, Ralph Brown. These are some of the people from that era, still in prison, some of them, that we should not forget, because they are victims of the same process that we have here. But one of the things that was different was that after this period began to come to a close, there was an investigation by Congress, the Church Committee, and they came out with a group of findings on this, and they said this is absolutely unforgivable. You cannot do this in a democracy, to have the government turn on people and prosecute them and harass them and act illegally outside your own boundaries against your own domestic people. And I think somehow in there is a line that was drawn between attacking foreign ideologies, which I think is wrong, I don't think you should be doing it, and domestic ideologies, liberation groups and so on. And I think that's one of the important distinctions that we're going to see today, one of the issues that comes up in the present situation. All right, so what does the present situation look like? Well, we have clearly a war against something going on. What is it? They call it a war on terror. What is that? The Patriot Act has defined this thing so broadly that it would include almost a large part of what we consider normal dissent, because obviously terror has to do with influencing governmental actions taken to influence government policy. And so if we take that, of course, you're already framing this as a debate against dissent. So if it's a war on ideology, I would suggest that rather than calling it a war on terror, it's probably more accurate to say a war on ideology. And what the government is essentially doing is going in and looking for ideology that suggests that people might do something in the future that would cause harm to us. And if they can find that kind of ideology somewhere in that person's background, they are then going to act to preemptively prosecute that person, to prevent them from actually committing a crime. And that's where the term preemptive prosecution comes from. You prosecute the person before they commit a crime, based on the presumption that if they have a particular ideology, they may be sympathetic to committing some sort of a crime in the future. Now, is this profoundly illegal from our point of view? Of course it is. You're not supposed to ever prosecute somebody for a crime they haven't committed. And I think one of the best proofs of it is if you look at this list here, look at there's a large number of people here. How many people on this list, and I calculated roughly, my guess is the average jail sentence that they're serving is about 20 years. Some of them are serving life sentences, some of them have less sentences, but I would say the average jail sentence on here is about 20 years. For 20 years, you'd think you would have probably committed a pretty bad act somewhere along the line. All these people on this list, there's not a single death. Not even a single attempted death. There is no property damage. Nothing happened. These are all happened preemptively. And of course the government would say, yeah, oh, duh, that's what we're doing. We're prosecuting these people before they can do something. And my answer to that is, you can't prosecute people for crimes that they didn't commit. And one of the best examples of that, I think, and I just want to mention this because I think it's important, they talk about, and I will talk just a minute about how they go about this, but one of the things they focus on are foreign terrorist organizations, designated foreign terrorist organizations. And the operative word there is foreign. Foreign designated terrorist organizations. We have plenty of domestic terrorist organizations. We have the Ku Klux Klan, we have the Aryan Nation, we have a whole bunch of these people. And they have training bases, and they indoctrinate people in hate, and they go marching around with guns. All of that is protected by the Constitution.
Yep.
All of that is protected by the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and so on. The foreign terrorist organizations, they have passed special laws called material support for designated foreign terrorist organizations, and guess who that takes into account? Well, that focuses all of the legal guns on immigrant communities, Muslim communities, all sorts of other people who happen to be somehow ethnically related to the organizations that we are designating as terrorists. With domestic terrorist organizations, the FBI observes them. They wait until they might actually commit a crime, until they can put together and say this is a conspiracy to commit an actual crime. With the foreign designated terrorist organizations, they're preemptively prosecuting them before they ever get there. When they go into somebody's house to search on one of these terrorism complaints, they're not looking for guns and bombs and bullets and things like that might have hurt. They're looking for books. They look at articles. They want to show that the person has an ideology that might lead to that down the road. So, what I want to just quickly go through, and then I'm probably already. How much time do I have?
You've got 5 minutes.
5 minutes. You're so good. They're really essentially
True, I wasn't lying.
There's essentially two. All right. Okay. There's essentially two ways that they do it. One way is through material support for terrorism laws. They will target you if you do anything that is somehow connected to a foreign terrorist organization. Any support at all. And that can be free speech, it can be charitable contributions, it can be actions that are trying to reduce violence in the world, and probably the best examples of that would be somebody like the Holy Land Foundation, where they were doing charity in the Middle East, and the directors were prosecuted. He was put in jail for 65 years. And his only crime was to build schools and hospitals in Palestine. Everybody conceded that none of the money went to the terrorists. But the argument was because that area was ruled by Hamas and other groups, the very fact that they were building schools and hospitals there enhanced the prestige of Hamas. That was designated support for designated terrorist organizations. So that's the kind of outlandish sort of law bending that you see when law is being used as a weapon of war. And the other major thing that they do when they go after people is that if they cannot find a material support, terrorism support law to get you on, they will try to bring in an agent provocateur to become your best friend, to go in and push you into it. And I think the best case of that would be Tariq Shah, he's a jazz musician down here. And he was, they signed two guys to him. The first person became so frustrated with the FBI because they couldn't find anything on him that he actually set himself on fire in front of the White House. They signed another guy to go in, and he became his best friend. He moved into his house with him, took lessons from him, and followed him around all the time with a tape recorder, trying to talk him into some sort of a crime. And finally, he got him pieced together enough of a conversation to make the case that he would have been willing to train Al-Qaeda people in martial arts. And so that was the basis on which he was done in. Yeah, martial arts, right. And so there's a whole case on him. So those are two kind of ways that they go after people, and I think the important thing to recognize here is that the facts of the case are not important. These are all trumped up. These are manufactured. This is and Carlos Montes is a great case right over here. This is a wonderful labor organizer who they went after because they thought he was connected with the peace activists. There's a bunch of peace activists up here, by the way. I'm just saying these are not all Muslims. There's some peace activists they're going after. But they couldn't get anything on Carlos Montes. They just didn't have a good case on him. So they went back 42 years into his record, and they found a conviction. And they said, you know, if that conviction was a felony, and he later bought a gun, which he did, that would be a violation of the state law, and so they went after him on that basis. As it turned out, the 42 years earlier was not a felony conviction. He believed it was a misdemeanor. Okay, I'm off. But
no, take your time. Say your last sentence.
Carlos Montes.
Carlos Montes. So, I mean, it's a good example of just to what length the FBI would go to get somebody.